The gun went off before anyone could breathe. It cracked through the night air of Incheon Port like a whip, snapping the world in half. And Shin Sora hit the ground behind a shipping container, her white coat already streaked with harbor grime, her pulse slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Two men in black were closing in from the east corridor, Busan faction. She could tell by the red insignia on their jacket collars. She had come here alone because her father had told her to wait. And she had learned, a long time ago, that waiting was another word for losing. She reached into her coat pocket, fingers closing around the taser, and made a decision. The first man rounded the container. She stepped out low and fast and drove 50,000 volts into his ribs. He went down like a dropped curtain, legs folding wrong, jaw slamming concrete. The second man raised his weapon and then stopped because something hit him from behind with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before and found it boring. He crumpled. Behind him, unhurried, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket, stood Kang Jae-won. He was taller than she remembered. Or maybe it was the dark that made him larger. He had his locks pulled back tonight, a charcoal coat settling over broad shoulders, and he was looking at her the way a chess player looks at a move they didn't expect, not alarmed. Interested. You called me, he said. Sora straightened. Her heart was still trying to escape her chest, but her voice came out level. I didn't call you. Your location was in the server logs. A pause. You knew I'd check. She stared at him for one long beat. Then, against everything, she almost smiled. Smart. Or stupid. The ghost of something moved across his face. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She had used those exact words to him, 10 days ago, in a tea house that smelled of chrysanthemum and cold ambition. He had remembered. She filed that away like a weapon. Deo appeared from the shadows with 4 Hawk men behind him, and the remaining Busan operatives scattered the way rats scatter from light. In 2 minutes, the port was quiet again, just the low moan of the harbor wind and the distant knock of boat hulls against the dock. Sora brushed grime from her sleeve. Her coat was ruined. She did not particularly care. How bad is it? Jae-won asked Deo. They hit the east warehouse. Just inventory. The shipment moved yesterday. Deo glanced at Sora. She took out the one near gate 4 before we even got here. I know, Jae-won said, and he looked at her again when he said it. Not with approval, exactly. With something more unsettling than approval. Recognition. Sora crossed her arms. I had it handled. I know that too. Then why come? He was quiet for a moment. Around them the harbor breathed its cold salt breath, and the city behind it blazed orange and indifferent. His eyes, when they found hers, were absolutely still in the way that deep water is still, and just as difficult to read the bottom of. Because you left the log open, he said. On purpose. She did not answer. She did not have to. The silence between them said enough, and they both heard it. Bell, before we go further, if you're already hooked, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like. Let's get into it. She rode back to the city in Jae-won's car because Deo had quietly engineered it so that hers was suddenly unavailable. She sat in the back seat, her ruined coat folded in her lap, watching the highway lights drag orange streaks across the window glass. Jae-won sat beside her and did not speak for 11 minutes. She counted. My father is going to know I was here, she said finally. I know. He'll use it. He'll say it proves I need to be kept closer. Managed. She said the word like it tasted wrong. He'll move the timeline on the marriage clause. Jae-won turned his head toward her, just slightly. Is that what you're afraid of? I'm not afraid of anything. The words came out too fast, and she hated herself for it. She looked back at the window. I'm annoyed. There's a difference. Is there? It wasn't a question. She turned to look at him then, really look, because the tone of it pulled at something behind her sternum. He was watching her with that same expression she couldn't classify, the one that had lived in her head since the tea house meeting, since he'd leaned across the table and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, that's not an answer. Nobody had ever noticed she wasn't answering before. What do you want from this arrangement? She asked. The real answer. Not what you told my father. A full 10 seconds of silence. Jae-won looked forward, jaw set, and she thought he was going to say something clean and political, something that would close the door and lock it. I want the alliance, he said, and I want to understand you. She blinked. That's a strange combination. You're a strange person. She should have been offended. She wasn't. My father thinks he's placing a piece on the board. He doesn't know the piece has been studying the board for years. How long? Since I was 14. He used to bring me to meetings and tell me to pour tea. She paused. I poured the tea. I memorized every number they said. Jae-won was quiet again. But it was a different quiet now, not guarded. Something in him had shifted almost imperceptibly, like a wall settling on its foundations. My mother ran a jajangmyeon shop in Itaewon, he said. She worked 17 hours a day. My father did cargo loading at the docks. I was their delivery boy before I was anything else. His voice was flat and factual, the voice of someone who has made peace with a story by telling it without decoration. Every room I walked into, someone had already decided what I was allowed to be. Sora watched the side of his face. The city light moved over him in slow waves. So you made rooms, she said softly. He turned to look at her, and something in his eyes was different now. She thought she might be the only person who had ever finished a sentence like that and been right. Yeah, he said. I made rooms. The car pulled up to the Hawk penthouse tower, and neither of them moved to open the door for a long moment. She should have gone home. She knew that. She was standing at the window of his penthouse at 2 in the morning, soul blazing gold and relentless below, wearing a borrowed black shirt that was 3 sizes too large, and the only reasonable explanation she could give herself was that her own car still wasn't available and she was simply being practical. She wasn't being practical. Deo had disappeared 30 minutes ago with a smile that said too much and a comment about checking the perimeter that fooled absolutely nobody. Jae-won had brought her a glass of water and set it on the windowsill beside her and sat in the armchair across the room, and they had been doing this strange calibrated nearness, for the better part of an hour. Tell me about the Incheon route deal, he said. She glanced at him. Now, I think well at night. She almost laughed. She was horrified to realize how easy it would be to actually laugh around him, how close the feeling was to the surface. She pressed it back down and looked at the city. The Busan faction has been cutting into the southern port access for 8 months, she said. My father lost 2 transit contracts because his people couldn't guarantee safe passage. He's bleeding, Jae-won, even if he won't say it. The alliance isn't just useful for him, it's survival. She paused. He won't admit that to you. So I'm admitting it. Silence. Why, he asked. Because a deal built on half-truths collapses, she said simply. And I don't want this one to collapse. She heard him stand. She did not turn around. His footsteps crossed the room, slow, deliberate, until he was standing a few feet behind her, looking out at the same city. She was acutely aware of every inch of the space between them. Your version of the clause, he said. Partnership, not matrimony. Exit provisions for both parties. Yes. Your father thinks I want to keep you close regardless. That you've built yourself into the deal so deeply that you'll end up married to it anyway. Her jaw tightened. He told you that. He told Deo. Deo tells me everything. She turned then, because she needed to see his face when she asked the next question. He was closer than she'd expected, close enough that she could see the faint gold of the lamp catching the angles of his face, close enough that stepping back would be an admission. Do you think he's right? She asked. Jae-won looked at her for a long time. The careful blankness he wore like armor was still there, but there was something behind it now, something that watched her with too much attention for a man who felt nothing. I think, he said slowly, that you rewrote a contract in secret, walked it across enemy lines, negotiated without authority, and got me to sign something I normally would have drafted myself. He let that land. I think your father underestimates what he raised. White Medium Star, we're at the halfway point, and it's getting intense. Make sure you've liked this video and subscribed so you don't miss how this ends. That's not an answer, she said. He almost smiled. You remember that. You said it to me first. I know. His voice had gone quieter. I'm answering you now. I think you're the most dangerous person I've met in 10 years. And I think you know it. And I think that's the loneliest thing in the world, to know exactly how capable you are and spend your whole life in a room that keeps making itself smaller. Sora felt something crack in her chest, quiet and sudden, like ice giving way on a river. She had not been prepared for that. She had prepared for coldness, for negotiation, for the polite violence of men who reduced women to clauses. She had not prepared for someone to simply see her and say so. Don't do that, she said, and her voice came out wrong, too thin. Do what? Say true things in that voice. He looked at her steadily. What voice? She didn't answer. She turned back to the window because looking at him was starting to cost something she hadn't budgeted for, and she needed one more moment of armor before it was fully gone. My father called you a necessary inconvenience, she said. When you first rose, he said the Hawk Syndicate was useful but temporary. He said a mixed-blood man without deep family roots couldn't hold power in Seoul for long. She paused. I told him he was wrong. A beat. You defended me, Jae-won said. Before we ever met. I defended good strategy. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true, and she thought he knew it too, because he was quiet in the way he got quiet when he was choosing not to say the thing that would break something open prematurely. She appreciated that restraint. She also found it maddening. I want to run the Incheon operation, she said. Not advise. Run. My name on the chain of command. That'll make your father furious. My father is already furious. He has a range, furious to volcanic. I've learned to live comfortably in the lower range. Jae-won moved to stand beside her at the window, shoulder almost touching her shoulder. Almost. He looked at the city the way she had seen him look at it before, not watching, owning. If your name is on the chain of command, he said, it's a Hawk chain. You answer to me. I answer to the operation's success. You happen to be funding it. That's a distinction I'd normally argue. But you won't. He turned his head to look at her. Profile to profile, a breath of air between them. His eyes moved over her face with something that she could only describe as wanting to memorize it, and she felt her own pulse react before she could stop it. No, he said softly. I won't. She swallowed. The city burned on below them, indifferent to whatever this was. This terrible, inconvenient gravity pulling two people who had built entire architectures of control directly toward each other. Jae-won. Sora. If I stay till morning, she said, it will change things. I know. My father will find out. He'll weaponize it. I know that too. And you still. I'm not asking you to stay, he said. And then, quieter. I'm not asking you to go. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp threw gold across half his face. The other half was shadow. That was him exactly, she thought. Half illuminated, half unknown, and all of it worth the risk of learning. She stayed. Morning came in through the floor-to-ceiling windows like an accusation. Pale gold and merciless, the kind of light that shows everything clearly and forgives nothing. Sora was still at the window. She had not slept. She wasn't sure Jae-won had either, though he had taken the armchair eventually and gone very still in the way that might have been rest or might have been the practiced stillness of a man who had learned to look calm during storms. She was watching the city wake up when she heard him move. He came to stand beside her again, coffee in hand. He'd made 2 cups at some point in the quiet hours before dawn, placed one wordlessly beside her, and she had drunk it without comment, which felt like its own kind of agreement between them. Your father called Dao's line at 4, he said. What did Dao tell him? That you were in a secured location. That the port situation required overnight management. Sora turned the coffee cup in her hands. Clever. He's earned his salary. A silence. Outside, Seoul was becoming itself again. The hum of highways, the first distant voices, a delivery truck grinding its gears below. The city didn't know anything had shifted. Cities never did. He'll come here, she said. My father. If I don't go back within the hour. I know. And if he comes here, it gives him leverage. He'll tell the Busan faction that the Hawk boss compromised himself. He'll use it to renegotiate from a position of, she stopped. Jae-won, are you listening to me? Every word, he said. He was looking at her, not the city. He had been looking at her since he stood up. You're doing the thing you do. What thing? Making yourself the variable. Planning for every consequence except the one where you just let something be what it is. She opened her mouth. Closed it. He was right, and she hated it with a specific and intimate kind of hatred reserved for truths you have been running from long enough that they know your stride. If I let this be what it is, she said carefully, then I have given my father exactly what he wanted, just by a different route. Is that the only reason it would scare you? The question landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the ripples moved outward, and she stood in them, not moving, not answering, which was its own answer. Jae-won set down his coffee cup. He crossed the room to her slowly, and this time there was no almost about the distance. He stood in front of her, close enough that she had to angle her face up to keep her eyes on his, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him like a low current in the air between them. I will not be a cage, he said. I need you to hear that. Words, she said, but it came out unsteady. Then hear this instead. He reached up, slowly, giving her every chance to move, and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. His thumb grazed her cheek in the process, one careful graze, nothing more, but her breath caught audibly, and there was no recovering from that. You rewrote the deal, he said, his voice low. You can rewrite any deal. You and I both know there is no version of this that has you trapped unless you agree to it. A pause. Do you agree to it? She looked up at him. The gold morning light made him magnificent and real and terrifying. She thought about her father's voice. You are an asset, Soria. She thought about 14 years of pouring tea and memorizing numbers. She thought about the contract she had rewritten, the port she had defended alone in the dark with a taser and nothing but her own conviction, the deal she had closed on her own terms. No, she said. I don't agree to it. Something in Jae-won's face changed. Not relief, exactly. Something deeper and less manageable. Good, he said. He lowered his hand. He stepped back just far enough to restore the space between them. But something had changed in the room. The air was different now, charged with the specific electricity of two things that have acknowledged each other. I'm going to put your name on the Incheon chain of command, he said. Deo will draw up the amendment today. She blinked. Just like that. You've been running that operation mentally for weeks. I saw it in the proposal. Your fingerprints are on every clause. My father will. Your father, Jae-won said, is going to have to learn that he built a general and tried to use her as a flag. Sora stared at him. And then something happened that she had been holding back since the harbor, since the port and the taser and his voice saying you called me. Something unguarded moved across her face, and she let it, just for a second, just enough for him to see. She smiled. A real one. Not diplomatic, not performed. The actual smile of someone who has been in a cold place for a long time and is only just realizing they've walked into warmth. Jae-won saw it. He did not make a thing of it. He just looked at her like he was going to remember that smile for the rest of his life, quietly, without fanfare, the way you remember the first time you heard a piece of music that broke you open. She left when the sun finished rising. He walked her to the car himself. Not Deo, not a driver. Him, which was the kind of gesture that said more than any conversation could, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it, which was also the kind of gesture that said everything. Thursday, she said at the car door. The amendment review. Thursday, he agreed. She got in. The car pulled out. She watched the building shrink in the rearview mirror until the city swallowed it, and she pressed two fingers briefly against her cheek, where his thumb had grazed it. Then put her hand back in her lap and looked forward, because looking back was a luxury, and she had never been able to afford luxury before. Today, she thought, she might start learning to. In the penthouse, Jae-won stood at the window where she had stood, and looked out at the city, and Deo appeared at his elbow with two fresh cups of coffee and the expression of a man who has been exercising enormous patience. Don't, Jae-won said. Wasn't going to say a word, Deo said serenely. You were composing a speech. I was composing nothing. I was simply observing that you washed her car until you literally could not see it anymore, which you have never done for anything, not once, not in the 12 years I have known you. Deo sipped his coffee. But I wasn't going to say that. Jae-won looked at the city. A slow breath. Something in him was very quiet right now, not the careful stillness he performed for rooms full of enemies. Something real. Something he didn't have a word for yet, but intended to figure out, the way he intended to figure out everything that mattered. Draw up the Incheon amendment, he said. Already started. Deo paused. Jae-won. She's the only one who's ever gotten you to sign her version of anything. Jae-won picked up his coffee, looked at the city. I know, he said. And for once, he didn't say anything else. In the Shin residence, on Sora's desk where the ledgers lived, a dark orchid waited in a glass vase. She hadn't put it there. It had been on the doorstep when she arrived. No note, no name. She knew. She set her bag down and looked at it for a long moment, the deep purple-black of the petals against the pale morning light. Beautiful and unlikely, the kind of thing that survived despite being underestimated. She sat down. She opened her laptop. She created a new document and titled it simply, Amendment, Thursday. Then she began to write, and for the first time in a very long time, she was writing something entirely her own. Belle, if this story had you from the first gunshot to that last orchid, subscribe, hit the like button, and drop a comment. Team Sora, Team Jae-won, or are you just here because Deo deserves his own story? Because honestly, he does. See you next time. Wilted Flower.